God, help us to have faith that you are the one who is finding us. Help us to have the courage to wait for you. To wait for you to do something in our world, to do something in our lives. Help us not to trust in ourselves. Help us to trust in you. Amen. All right. Yeah, welcome. Come on in. Yeah. To remind us where we are, we're in week 3 of our study in miracles. Really, the big idea is about the presence of God. How is it possible that God is present in our lives, in our world, when, at least for many of us, it seems like that's something that was said of a bygone age. God used to act and do miraculous things, but does God actually do stuff like that anymore? So today we're talking about kind of our contemporary moment, and I'll talk about some of the phenomena that people talk about today if they talk about God's presence in the world, and we'll try to. Let me see if I can advance the slide. Cassie, I think I'm not advancing the slide. It was working a minute ago, but. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. It's working now. Okay, I'm now moving fast. Okay, so just to recap. Week 1, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the secular world, which can sometimes be used as kind of like a negative thing, like, that's a secular thing, there's a secular person. The argument that Charles Taylor makes that I think is pretty much won the day in terms of sociology, anthropology, even theology, is that we all live in a secular world whether we like it or not. That is to say, we inhabit a world that is modern, that has different conceptions, different assumptions than people who lived 500 years ago. And part of this secular age, part of our concern in this class, in this session of conversations, is what Taylor calls the immanent frame. And this is the idea, there's a separation between immanence, that is stuff in this world that you can touch, smell, taste, see, things that science can measure and discuss and predict, and then transcendence, which basically would mean anything supernatural, paranormal, anything beyond our own material physical experience, anything beyond the material world. And what Taylor says is that about 500 years ago, everyone assumed that the transcendent world, a world of spirits, above God, but also of evil spirits and so on, was thoroughly present in and out of our material world. It was present in the power of things like relics. The bones of a saint were understood to be efficacious. They could do stuff. But also the presence of evil things. Things could be imbued with evil spirits and evil presence. And that the human body was essentially porous. That is, that the spiritual world could kind of waft through us like a breeze, blowing through a field of grass on a summer day. What Taylor says is that today we live in a world where we apply kind of a frame almost, a lens, like you're looking through glasses, right? If it's tinted, you see everything with that color. What Taylor says is that we assume that the world is purely immanent, and that we might talk about transcendence and things like this, but ultimately many of us living in this modern age are kind of taught from the time we're young until now, we're taught to presume that the world is what we can touch, taste, smell, measure with our eyes and our ears, our sensory perceptions, right? And that we can predict the world this way. And of course, we all really do believe this. All of us get in cars and drive them. We can't explain how they work, but we know that someone has built these things, and we trust that they're going to function. We trust that when we push the gas pedal, we're going to accelerate, and we can predict the rate of our acceleration because we've driven the car before. We know we can brake these things, right? We just assume the laws of physics. We know how these things work, and we trust them, that they're going to continue to work like this. Otherwise, you would never get in an airplane, right? We all trust that Bernoulli's principle will make the airplane fly up in the sky. Some of us have a hard time with that even while we're flying, but ultimately we presume that this is possible and that this is true and reliable. And that's, in a way, the immanent frame when we start to presume that everything functions this way and that there's nothing outside of this function. That is to say, there's nothing outside of our scientific world that we can touch, taste, smell, and see. One of the things that Taylor talks about that we'll return to is that while we assume this kind of immanent frame, we also find it hard to really truly believe in anything. Taylor calls this the fragilization of belief. And that is to say that even people who are hardcore atheists have kind of moments of doubt. That is to say, everyone doubts. Very faithful people doubt all the time, and unfaithful people doubt about their doubting all the time. That is to say that we live in a world where it's difficult to kind of fully trust in anything, and we'll get to that later too. Last week we talked about miracles in the Bible, and also how we might read those miracles in the Bible. And the big question, of course, is do we take these things literally or not? There are a lot of folks who live in the immanent world that we live in, our secular world, and of course we look at these stories of miracles in the Bible and we might say, well, we believe that, like, I can transmit a radio signal, I can call on my cell phone and it'll go up to a satellite and it'll come down. That would have looked like magic to people in the ancient world. Just therapy might have seemed like magic to people in the ancient world, right? I mean, that is to say, kind of rudimentary medicine might have been magic to ancient people in the ancient world. That maybe they just kind of didn't know as much as us, and so that's why they write these stories about miracles. Maybe, perhaps, right? Or maybe these stories are just kind of meant morally, or they're a symbol of something like, the power of life or something like this. They're kind of not intended to be taken literally, perhaps. And of course, these are explanations that come out of people's feeling of discomfort about living in a secular age and reading these stories that come from a world that presumed God's activity, or if you were not a Christian or you were not a Jew, the many gods, right? The folks of, say, Rome, imagine there were many, many gods at work in the ancient world. But still, everyone believed that there were many gods or one God active in the world and throughout. So one of the things that we talked about last time was that historically, right, in this kind of ancient setting, everyone did presume that there wasn't just a purely symbolic meaning to miracles or something, or a purely moral meaning to miracles. They believed that the gods could act in the world. That was what everyone presumed in the ancient world. Divine power was everywhere. So of course they believed these things literally. But the question also then is, could they also believe things symbolically? And Jesus, we said, talks about this himself. He interprets his own miracles symbolically as well. That is, he does a miracle of the bread. And then in John 6, he talks about how this is a symbol for how he can feed people spiritual food as well. So my argument was that both we can think literally and symbolically. These aren't just kind of ancient proofs for who Jesus was or something. And also, they're not just symbols of something or purely kind of hypothetical things to make us feel good or something like this. So maybe we can think a little more complicated ways about that today. But then also we talked about the natural world, these assumptions about natural laws, right? If you read something that seems to break natural laws, of course it can't happen then. And many folks in our current environment would talk about that right now, right? To say, of course I'm not going to believe anything that would break a natural law. We then talked, though, about how science doesn't think about laws in these ways, right? That natural laws aren't enforceable like speed laws, right? Like you got caught in a speed trap and you have to pay a fine. If a particle of light travels faster than 186,000 miles per second, it doesn't have to pay a fine. There's no universal traffic cop that's like stopping it. God doesn't write a ticket. That is to say that natural laws really are just predictions. They are accumulations of observations that have been added up over time. And of course, like Bernoulli's principle, Bernoulli's law, right, which the idea that if air goes underneath a wing, right, it's going to kind of give it lift, right? That is to say that airplanes work. I believe in these things, right? I trust my life on these things. I trust my life to the calculations of friction, right? So that brake pads are going to actually stop a car when I get in it, right? I do trust these things. But the question, though, too, is what if something doesn't follow these rules or principles? And that's what we talk about when we talk about miracles. Is it possible for God, the creator of the universe, if we believe there's a God, is it possible for this God to interrupt these kind of typical things? And we might think this is kind of like a modern way of thinking about it, but this is, of course, how ancient people thought about it. Ancient Israelites didn't think that water tended to kind of pile up in giant mounds so you could walk across any lake you wanted, right? They thought that was an interruption of the normal way that things went about. These ancient folks understood the world pretty well and were able to predict tides and how waters flowed. They knew that the water didn't just stop flowing and then crush Egyptian armies all the time. This was supposed to be an interruption, a miraculous interruption of how the world actually worked. What we talked about with these miracles in the Bible, if we look at them, there's really two big parts to these stories. The stories begin with people being amazed. And again, It's not like they thought this stuff happened all the time. It is an amazing thing to these people in the Bible. When Jesus heals someone, they don't say, oh, cool, that happens all the time. I expect this to happen. It makes them amazed. And so we read the book of Acts, let's say. There seem to be miracles on every page. Well, as we said, you're reading like the kind of highlight reel, the greatest hits, right? If you watch an American football game and you come from like Europe, you might be like, oh, I've seen some highlights. There's like action all the time. There's great plays. No, you've seen the highlight reel. Most of the game of football, anyone who's been to an Atlanta Falcons game, most of it's just sitting there twiddling your thumbs, right? There's a lot of time spent just sitting around. And that's true of the Bible too. That is to say, we assume in the book of Acts that most of these 50 years of Paul's ministry were him just kind of twiddling his thumbs. But we see these moments of interruption, of miraculous interruption, and people are filled with wonder. And this wonder really is wondering. They wonder who did this, why, and it's not always predetermined. That is to say, people who see these things and witness them in the Gospels, let's say, they don't say, okay, I understand the Trinity. This is a proof of Jesus' divinity and so on. No, they don't say that kind of stuff. They say, wow, and they say, why, how, who, what is this? They are prompted to ask a bunch of questions. And then they witness. They go and tell people about it. And sometimes their telling people about it includes that they don't really understand everything that they saw or witnessed. I say this because for many folks who read the Bible and then say, okay, we got to take these things literally, they're proofs of Jesus. They're proofs of Jesus' divinity. The resurrection is proof that everything I believe about God is true, the proof the Bible's true. That's not how ancient Christians understood these things. They didn't think that they just immediately proved everything that you thought was true. They had to be interpreted. That is to say, the meaning of miracles was something that was kind of left, in a way, left open. And the community had to think and talk about these things and pray about them. So there was a discernment element, a community discernment element to all of these stories. And that'll be important for us as we think about what we see in the modern world today. So just to kind of remind us, this is the typical kind of way that miracles happen in the Bible if we draw it out schematically. Some, of course, don't follow this pattern, but most people want some solution to a problem and they cry out. And as we said, there's lots of people in the Bible who cry out and want a solution and don't get it, or at least don't get it on their timetable, or don't get the one they want. And this doesn't have to do with their faith necessarily. Jesus does talk about how sometimes like your faith has healed you, but Jesus doesn't walk around saying, hey, I didn't heal you because you didn't have faith. That is to say, it's not a one-to-one correlation between faith and miracles. This is really important, I think, and we'll get to this today as well. So in any event, people want a solution, they cry out, and then sometimes, without explanation why, there's never like a time where Jesus walks through like the checklist of things you have to do to get a miracle. But sometimes there is this unusual event that occurs. And as we said, in these different miracles, feeding miracles, natural world miracles, the purpose seems to be to increase life. To save life, preserve life, increase the quality of life, to feed people, to sustain people who are wandering, to free oppressed people like Egypt, like Israel and Egypt. That is to say that these moments, God seems to be saying something, quite vague, but saying something through these events about life and also about death. That God is the God of both life and death. So then, in these stories, people observe and are stunned and wonder why, who is this who does these things? And sometimes people even wonder, is this evil power, right? People ask, is this Beelzebub that's doing this? Is this the devil that's doing this stuff? Remember, Jesus says, no, a house divided among itself can't stand, right? That is to say that Jesus has to kind of argue with people to try to interpret these miracles. No, they're not bad miracles, they're good ones. So again, these are open questions that people are asking each other. Who did this? Why? What does this mean? And then, of course, there's this element where some of the people, not all of them, but some will go and talk about these things and tell people about the wonders that they've seen. And that's witness. They witness to this. And remember, there's some people who don't. There's the 10 lepers and 9 of them go home and go to their work and they don't care. And then the one comes back and says, thank you to Jesus, right? That is to say, some people don't witness when they have these things. And this is not just a bad thing. This isn't like a bad character trait or something. At least in today's world, a lot of people see things that are pretty strange, that might, we think, break natural laws, and you might be pretty worried about saying that stuff in public, about telling your neighbor what you saw, or even telling your pastor. there's the vast percentage of people who will say, yes, I've seen something supernatural or experienced something quite strange that I can't explain. People who check yes on that box in a survey, most of them haven't even told their pastors about this. Most of them, I think it's 83%, haven't told anyone about the experiences that they've had. And why? Because we live in an imminent world. We live in a world that tells us we're pretty crazy if we think we've encountered some things like this. So that's what we'll talk about today. And of course, the resurrection of Jesus is the culmination of all of these miracles. The New Testament lifts this up as the miracle par excellence. And we'll get back to that next week. All right, so on to today's stuff. We've kind of recapped a little bit. But what do we do in our own secular world when we think we've encountered the presence of God? Remember, 500 years ago, it wasn't hard at all to talk about miracles. In Luther's day, he talks about seeing the devil, and he's using the restroom when he sees the devil, and he picks up a pile of his own feces and throws it at the wall, and so on, right? He's seeing and participating in this stuff, but at the same time, Luther and other reformers who come after him begin to ask critical questions of the Catholic Church, who at the time was promoting miracles and talking about saints and so on, and also in some ways profiting off of it through the sales of things like indulgences, right? This is part of Luther's criticism, is we're too gullible. We're too gullible when it comes to all of these stories that we've been told. So be skeptical and think critically about this stuff. Don't be too easily persuaded about this. Be rational about this. Be skeptical, even, Luther says. And at the same time, we took that advice. There's no David Hume without Luther. There's nobody who says, hey, there's no miracles, without Luther at first saying, hey, let's be skeptical about miracles. So, again, all these different practices that people were doing in the ancient world and some today, Luther said, let's think very carefully about these things. So the end result of this, though, is that today, the supernatural is relegated to the ridiculous, right? The conspiracy theorists, the quacks, right? Shows like X-Files, which are fun, but people kind of laugh at. And then, stuff like the Bigfoot sighting and so on, which is just kind of the kind of realm of endless jokes and so on, right? So this is kind of like the world of scholarship in general. And so, my story of coming out of a seminary, right, I'm going to a PhD program. I went to Emory University for my PhD in religious studies. It's not a confessional program. They have a school of theology, but I was in the graduate division of arts and sciences, and I was in religious studies. And they take that very seriously. It's not a confessional place. We don't pray before class when you go to get a PhD at Emory in religion. There might be Muslims and Jews and atheists in your class, right? You're having a conversation about religious studies. So the conversation is about the methods. What methods do we use as scholars to study the practices of religion? That's really the way that people come at it, right? So if you start talking about miracles, people start to kind of, start to talk about kind of strange things, right? People start to kind of squinch their noses up because that just sounds unscholarly. It sounds unserious today, right? That doesn't fit in my imminent frame. So there's just no conversation about these kinds of things. You're talking instead about like interpreting ancient texts or grammar, or you're talking about surveys of people, and you might talk about what they say they experience, but there's no conversation about the reality of that or anything like that. So I even was TAing a class, kind of a teacher assistant in a class during my PhD program at the Candler School of Theology. So this is like ministers in training in this classroom, some people who were already ministers in the class, and a professor who was an ordained minister, by the way, was teaching the class, and it was on Old Testament. And this professor was teaching, and one of the students raised their hands and said, well, what is this, how do you interpret this through Jesus? And I forget what the topic was about, but it was, I think, about prophecy in the Old Testament. And so what does this have to say about Jesus? And the professor, no kidding, in a room full of ministers in training, this person, an ordained minister himself, said, well, that's a question about the Greco-Roman era, and I'm just a historian of ancient Israel, so I go up to the Greco-Roman period. So Jesus is a Greco-Roman era figure, so I don't really have anything to say about that. You'll have to ask the New Testament class. So that is to say, and this is how we're trained, right? If I go talking about miracles in my Society for Biblical Literature annual meeting of scholars, like they would laugh at me and probably not take me seriously with anything I wrote from there on out. So this world, right, is really, and in the same way, many of you, not all of you, but many of you, if you go into your place of professional work and you start to talk about miracles that you've observed, they might look at you pretty strangely, and in some of you, there might be negative consequences to what you do, your advancement, your promotion, etc. So that is to say, we live in this world where this is pretty strange stuff. So, of course, when we think today, we think really about the world in terms of science, right? Science tells us the truth about the world. Science is the domain of truth. If you can't prove it scientifically, then you can't make laws in our culture about things that you can't talk about scientifically. Like even the Supreme Court has to talk about like science when they're doing cases about, let's say, abortion, right? You have to have these conversations as science ends up being kind of the arbiter of truth and falsity in many ways. You can't bring in religious argument, purely religious argument, God says we shouldn't, and put it before the Supreme Court and be like, okay, you guys got it? Is this great? Yeah. No, you can't argue that way, even in popular culture. We have to kind of talk scientifically in a way. And that, in a way, means that morality, we have to kind of prove scientifically why it's better, with statistics and so on, about why it's safer for people to do this or that, et cetera. And this quote from Stephen Hawking, I think, tells us a little bit about this point of view. Religion believes in miracles, but these aren't compatible with science. That is to say, Hawking doesn't say miracles don't happen necessarily. That's not what this quote says, but it says like they're not overlapping. There's another scientist, Stephen Jay Gould, who talked about the non-overlapping magisteria. He's like, religion people talk about religion, and then science people talk about science, and they don't touch. They have completely different ways of seeing the world, and like they can talk about whatever, this religion people can do whatever they want. I'm just not going to listen to them, but you can. But they can't tell us scientists what to do, and scientists can't really tell them what to do either. So they're just non-overlapping ideas, right? There's another point of view here. Richard Dawkins is a great proponent of this idea. But yeah, any belief in miracles is contradictory not just to science itself or whatever, but to the spirit of science. The facts of science and the spirits of science. So contradictory to the facts of science, that might be the non-overlapping magisteria, but the spirit of science. We can't let these things coexist, really, is Dawkins' point of view. He wrote that book, The God Delusion, right? God isn't true, obviously, because we can't prove it through science. So it's bad for us. We need to actually get rid of this thing. Miracles contradict everything about science, even its spirit, right? We'll see that maybe this isn't true, though. One of the things that's really fascinated me, though, is that over the last century, science has gotten really weird. In fact, like you talk to people who are, when I'm at Emory talking to people who are in physics and things like this, and they sound a lot like mystics to me. So you think about particle wave duality. Have you ever really gotten into some of this stuff? The way that light works right now, the best explanation of how light works is that it kind of chooses whether to be a light wave or a particle based on who's observing it, but that actually changes the experiments that you do. Bizarre stuff. So for example, if you're observing light and kind of expecting it to act like a particle, it acts like a particle. If you're observing it with an experiment that tries to expect it to act like a wave, it acts like a wave. And it actually changes the experiment. Bizarre stuff. I was talking to somebody in the physics department, I was like, nope, that's not possible. That can't possibly be, right? Or you talk to folks about things like Schrodinger's cat, where the cat's both alive and dead at the same time in the box, and when you observe it, then it is alive or dead, but when you don't observe it, it's quantum superposition stuff. It sounds like nonsense to me. Or anything about quantum physics. Have you ever actually looked into quantum physics? Just try to find a YouTube video and just see how weird the world is at a small level, right? This doesn't explain things at our level of scale, but at tiny levels of scale, particles pop in and out of existence at random. And particles pass through other particles. Solid particles pass through other solid particles with no problem. Only at the quantum level. But it just it sounds absolutely insane to us, right? Or talk to an astrophysicist about things like the beginning or the end of the universe, or talk to them about dark matter and dark energy. And they start to sound like mystics. Well, we know this stuff exists. We can't possibly test for it. We can't see it. It doesn't take light. There's no way to observe it. But this is going to be the focus of our study for the next century. Amazing, right? So all to say that science has gotten weirder and weirder. And J.B.S. Haldane, who was a famous British scientist, worked a lot in genetics, was a geneticist, he says the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, it's queerer than we can suppose. This was an early 20th century quote. It's been You can find versions of this quote that are applied to Werner von Heisenberg, which he never said. But anyway, like, you can find other people associated with this quote, and the word queer is often changed to strange, just for modern kind of conceptions of language. But this is the original quote here. This is the actual guy who said it. But yeah, we can't even understand how strange science is, how strange the world actually is. And one of the things that J.B.S. Haldane even talks about, and other folks have talked about this since, is that human beings are created with a certain number of senses and with a certain kind of range of things that we can sense. And we can use technology to see more things than we can see, like ultraviolet light, right? We can't see with our eyes, we can test for it and so on. But at the same time, we're still kind of extending our senses. And how many weird things are there, like dark matter and dark energy, are out there that we can't possibly sense? That is to say, if I look at my dog has a certain way of perceiving the world. And there's lots of things my dog will just never understand because that's the way she's built, right? She's built a certain way. And we just need to presume, hey, we're built a certain way too. There's probably a lot of stuff out there that we will never understand and can't possibly understand. Like, for example, we know that the universe functions in many more dimensions than 3. We might be able to perceive part of a 4th dimension through time. That's another conversation. But nonetheless, we know that gravity works in a number of dimensions, perhaps 7, 9. We know that there are many dimensions out there that we can't possibly even begin to think about or probe. We can test for them mathematically, like using physics. Thinking about physics, some of these things have to exist for equations to work, for the world to work as it is. But just to give you a sense of how weird science really is, it's not just saying that the world is normal. So when you study natural science, Albert Hoffman says, when you study natural science and the miracles of creation, if you don't turn into a mystic, then you're not a natural scientist. Like I said, when I talk to the folks in the natural sciences at Emory, who are my PhD colleagues, I would sometimes just kind of ask them questions, and they would start to talk like mystics, and I'd say, you sound like medieval, like mystic or something, and they'd be like, no, I'm a person of science, right? But it does start to blur a little bit. Okay, so there are also a lot of events, ancient and modern, that are pretty strange. So I'll just give you one example of these. So this is the story of Anna Monaro. This is from 1934. It all started on March 8th, 1934. Maria Gherardi was a young woman lying sick in a hospital in Pirano, Istria, and she was tossing and turning in her bed at night. She couldn't sleep, and then at some point she noticed why she couldn't sleep. Something was waking her up, and it was an intense light. And she was sick, she was in bed, she couldn't really get out to see it, but she was kind of struggling to see what the heck was going on. Why is there a big light on? And she realized it didn't come from a lamp or a flashlight or a ceiling light. It came from the sleeping body of her neighbor in the bed next to her in the hospital in the middle of the night. So Maria, alarmed, screamed, got the attention of a nurse. The nurse came in, summoned other nurses, and they all agreed to inform the head of the hospital, Dr. Domenico Sambo, about this strange occurrence. Dr. Sambo was initially very skeptical, of course, but he went in finally to see the patient himself. Remember, this is the middle of the night, so getting the head of the hospital to wake up and come all the way down there and then end up reporting. So he said, fine, I'll come. He ends up going in to see the patient for himself, and he's sure, he says later, that there must be a perfectly reasonable explanation for what they're seeing. Human bodies don't glow, he tells the woman who was sent to go fetch him from his house. But after an actual exam of the sleeping woman, he admitted he was wrong. The patient, the 42-year-old Anna Monaro, was, in fact, emanating a bright bluish light. When the doctor woke Anna up and explained to her why everyone was gathered around her bed, she was confused. She was tired, she said, and according to newspaper reports, she wasn't particularly interested in the fact that her body was glowing. She was tired. She said it wasn't bothering her. She didn't feel bad, and she said later about the cause of the phenomenon, she just attributes it to some kind of divine intervention, but she's not sure. Several doctors and nurses witnessed this event, and eventually Anna was actually transferred to Rome so that the phenomenon could be studied more. The story of this luminous woman was so juicy that it became news across it was an international news event. So it was all over Italian newspapers at first, but then it was picked up in the foreign press, German, Hungarian, British publications. This is the New York Times from 1934. So it was April, so it was about a month later that where they started to have this stories in the American media and the British media. And you can see Dr. Sambro there, who thought this was a hoax, but in fact saw it for himself. And in fact, it gets stranger. Marconi, the guy who invented the radio. So Marconi himself shows up there to see about electromagnetism and light and emitting radio waves from this woman and studies her for a while and ends up saying, I can't explain any of this stuff. So that's not the only one of these stories, by the way. There's lots of stories of light emanating from people's bodies, often when they're very sick or near death. These stories are not contained to just Christian people and Christian places. These are actually found in times and places outside of Western Europe. There are stories from Tibetan Buddhists of kind of people emanating light. There are stories in ancient Rome, and of course, you've heard one from the Bible, the Transfiguration, where Jesus begins to emanate bright light. These are not, of course they're unusual. Wherever they happen, people end up being very skeptical and feeling strange about it, but also there are lots of these reports. These reports were witnessed by scientists themselves, and eventually they just went away, by the way, and then she got better and she left and never happened, never came back again. But she emanated blue light from her chest for about a month. Can't explain it, don't understand it, and do I know what this means? No, I have no idea what this means. I don't know what God's trying to tell her, or is this God? I mean, is this science? I don't know. I have no idea, but what I do know is that it breaks the bounds of my expectations about how the world works. And if I was her, I'd be really curious about this. If I was any of those scientists that saw it, I'd be really curious about it. And I gotta admit, I'm curious about it myself. Do I live in a world where this is possible? So, of course, I forgot to mention, of course, this has been studied in modern, in modern ways. There aren't videos of this, which of course is strange or whatever, but there are surveys that have been given. One academic decided to study this, passed out surveys at UK and Dutch homes for folks who were nearing death, right? So folks in hospice, people caring for those who had entered hospice were given these forms to fill out, and 50% of, this is in the year 2000, by the way, 2005, I think, Dutch, which is like one of the most secular nations on earth, 50% of these Dutch hospice workers said that they had witnessed strange light emanating from the bodies of people about to die. They said that it hadn't happened often, but they had witnessed it at least once. 33 or 35% of UK workers, again, a very secular place, right? And these are people working in a caregiving, right, profession, but 35 or so percent of them, 40% of Brazilian hospice workers, this was done in Brazil as well, 40% of Brazilian hospice workers say that they've witnessed this phenomenon at one point or another in their work. Now, I can look at the story of Anna and say, that's a strange story, right? That's just weird. They must have all been mistaken. Marconi must have just been mistaken. But when you see that 50% of Dutch hospice workers saying that they've seen this at some point or another, it's pretty weird, isn't it? And look, I'm not telling you have to believe it. I don't know if I fully believe it myself. At the same time, what do I do with this? All right, so somebody back in the year, right around the turn of the 20th century, also heard a lot of these stories. He was a famous sociologist, anthropologist, a famous scholar, William James, an American scholar, who had heard a lot of these stories, and he himself had already become a well-known scholar, had some international reputation, and he had always been interested in these stories of what he called religious experiences, things beyond normal experience. So he begins to collect these things, and then he begins to kind of put them into categories. And his whole thing is that, yes, one of these stories may be completely false, etc., but once you start to get hundreds of stories from different places and times and people who don't know each other, different cultures, and they all kind of have similar features to them, he says it's like a bundle of sticks. He says one stick is pretty weak, but you put them all together and you say, we're looking at something. This is some phenomena that should be studied. Now, again, he doesn't say he knows. He doesn't come up with any theology from this. Well, you gotta be Lutheran. No, it doesn't point to anything specific. He doesn't even say this points to the Christian God. He just says this is pretty strange stuff, and it points to the fact that the world is stranger than we might imagine. And he writes this book based on his lectures called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Still is a banger today. You can read this thing. It's readable. It's great. It's fascinating. A lot of great stories in there. And he divides up into four kind of moments. He says all of these experiences, the religious experiences, people feeling transported or having visions, whatever, they all seem to have four elements that they share. And the first one is passivity. You go out looking for these things, you're not going to find them. It just happens. People who spend all their lives looking for these, kind of experience, like looking for the big wave if you're a surfer, you're not going to find it, right? It just happens. So that is to say, this feeling of being grasped by a superior power and you're not in control of this experience, that seems to be a big part of it. And then he says ineffability is the second one. You can never put it into words. Everyone says this. I can't put this into words. There's no way to talk about this. There's no way to explain it, but I'll try. I'll try. Then the third he says is noetic, which means basically mind. And he says that there's some kind of like, people feel when they come away from these experiences like they've experienced a universal truth that they didn't know before. And they put this into different words. But the most common one is the world is a good place. People who have had terrible lives, have gone through terrible experiences, they end up coming away from these experiences. The most common one is, I learned that the world is a good place, that there's good for us. There's goodness around us. There's goodness in us. God is often a word that's evoked to talk about this experience, that God loves us is one of the biggest takeaways from these. And then lastly, transient. They're temporary. They happen for a time and they're gone. And again, you're not in control of when they come back. And for many people, they just happen once and then they never come back again. Some folks like Julian of Norwich and so on, some of these mystics, they end up kind of going on mystical quests all the time, but that seems to be pretty rare. So more recently, Dale Allison, a scholar, he's a New Testament professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. It's where I did my master's work, and Catherine, my wife, as well. But he wasn't there on the faculty at the time, but he joined the faculty fairly recently. He has an interesting story. He experienced some pretty weird stuff when he was in his teens, late teens. He had what he calls a couple of mystical experiences. Of course, he never really talked about it publicly because he was trying to become a scholar of renown. He became a scholar of renown. He's one of the most famous New Testament scholars today, very well respected, written tons of best-selling books. And last year, he ended up publishing this book, basically, which was like, now I'm going to throw my career away. So he ended up publishing this book, which was not only telling about his own experiences, which are kind of unexplainable, but also collecting lots of other experiences and also talking to people invested in science and in medicine, neuroscience, trying to explain some of these phenomena that people would call miracles. And so he wrote this book called Encountering Mystery, got it right here, and he's talking about how we live in a secular age. How is it possible that we can talk about these things? And he's not a quack. He's interested in actual evidence. He's interested in people's stories as well, but in combining stories. That is to say, we've got thousands of stories that all agree about something, that these people don't know each other and they're in different cultures and times and places. There might be something then for us to think about. So this is to say, he's trying to apply the same kinds of logic that he uses in his study of the ancient world to these, what he calls meta-normal experiences. I guess paranormal means sideways, meta-normal. He's trying to say these things have something to do with God. He's also very clear. He doesn't think that they have very definite content. Like, it's not trying to teach you about, I don't know, like a catechism or something, It's not the Heidelberg Catechism that you get from these things. That is to say, they're very vague experiences. But he nonetheless gathers a bunch of these. He's got a chapter on angels, which really he says, this is people that, when you have a vision of people or an experience of a person that is not there. And some of these happen in hospitals. There are doctors and nurses that talk about this together. There's shared experiences of people seeing someone in the room that appears and then disappears. There's some strange, of course, things that happen there. How do we explain these? We don't really know. But nonetheless, these patterns as well that we can see in experiences of feeling bliss. Kind of a blissful experience, nirvana, some people might say, just feeling kind of like a flash of love. We'll talk about a couple of these in a moment. He also puts together experiences of death, people who are nearing death. I mentioned one of these 2 lessons ago at the very end. I read the story of the person who had a temporary period of lucidity, but who had lost their entire brain to a tumor, to a lung tumor, in fact. They had no brain matter left, and yet they were able to have an extended conversation with friends and family. Terminal lucidity, this is called. And this is actually an ancient phenomenon. This is discussed in ancient Roman medical literature, which they didn't understand either. People who had had severe head trauma, people who had had tumors and so on, people who have lost the capacity for their brain to work, all of a sudden have a period of extreme lucidity right before their death. And what neuroscientists say today is we don't know how to explain this, because if the mind is contained in your brain and your brain is gone, then there's no way that this is possible. And so some scientists have started to say some pretty crazy things, like maybe your mind is not contained all in your brain. They don't know. They don't have a lot to say after that, but there's something else out there. So all to say, Dale Allison gathers all this stuff. If you're interested, it's a readable book. It's meant for folks, but also he's been on podcasts talking about it. I just encourage you to take a look and think about it. So again, these things are meant to spark wonder. There's also Dr. Bruce Grayson, wrote this book called After. Dr. Grayson is an actual doctor, a research doctor at the University of Virginia, has been running this lab for a long time. It's about 50 years ago, his quest started to try to figure out what NDEs are, or near-death experiences. Now, I know these have become very popular lately. Some of the stories seem more or less credible. Some of them seem to be perhaps fabricated to make a lot of money off of them. Some have been sold and turned into movies. But I assure you, if you're skeptical like I was about this phenomenon, there's actual medical research going on about these. And Dr. Grayson is one of the people who's been doing this for a long time. So how did Dr. Grayson, who grew up in a completely non-religious household, he's a self-described skeptic, how did he come to study near-death experiences? Well, one day, about 50 years ago, when he was eating spaghetti in a hospital cafeteria, his pager went off, it startled him. He wound up getting spaghetti sauce on his tie, which he hid under his lab coat. He'd been called to see a young woman named Holly, who tried to commit suicide and was now unconscious in a bed in the hospital. So he went to a nearby room, not the room where Holly was, but a nearby room to talk to the woman's friend about what had happened. And at that point, he unbuttoned his lab coat to reveal his stained tie. Well, the next day, he didn't even see Holly that day. The next day, he goes to see Holly, the young woman who was now conscious. And Holly indicated that she had been in the neighboring room as Grayson and her friend had their conversation. And Holly mentioned that she had seen a spaghetti sauce stain on his tie. Grayson was puzzled. How could Holly possibly have known about that stain? And why would anyone mention this to her as a part of a complicated plot to befuddle the doctor into believing that she had been awake when she hadn't been? It just didn't make any sense. Why would anyone want to play a trick on him like this? But Holly insisted that she had been there, and she had actually been lying unconscious in a different room at the time. So that didn't make any sense either. And Grayson started to actually pursue these stories, which had been thought of as kind of quack stories up until that point. He has, in this book, put together a bunch of these different stories. Again, they don't follow any one particular religion, any one particular culture, any one particular place on earth. This is a universal human phenomena. About 5% of people in the world have had this. And these near-death experiences tend to follow very similar patterns. They begin with people saying that they are floating, they're moving above, they have an out-of-body experience, and they float up. Some of these get really weird. People know stuff that happened in rooms that they weren't in. There's one amazing story where this is part of Grayson's research. This is validated by nurses and doctors in the hospital at the time. This young woman dies. She says later, after she is revived, she says that she floated above the hospital and saw a shoe, a blue athletic shoe that was on the roof of the hospital. And a maintenance worker went up there and found a blue shoe on the roof, which was not visible from inside or below the hospital. So this is, really, really strange stuff. Now, do I know what happened? Can I prove this to you? No, but this is something that 5% of humanity says that they've undergone. And they undergo these very similar steps. So this kind of out-of-body experience, often they say that they see some sort of light. They're moving through darkness into light. They say that they often see people that they've known who have died before them. They often learn something. There's like some information they're given. Sometimes this is pretty surprising information. And then they often say that they are told that it's not their time, that they need to go back. So they return. And one other thing is that 99.6% of these people who go through this experience say it was 100% real. It was more objective than my day-to-day experience. It was not a vision, a hallucination. I was there. And on top of this, is 95% or so, depending on the survey, say it was an overwhelmingly positive experience. In fact, doctors hate people who have gone through this experience because they don't take their advice seriously anymore. People go back to smoking and they take up dangerous hobbies because they say they're not afraid of death anymore. Now again, 5% of people, it's between 1 and 5 depending on the survey, say that it was a negative experience. For most of these folks, it's because they lost control. They said, I want control of my life and I felt out of control, and that was really negative. There are some other folks, less than 1%, very small percentage, that end up saying they had a really negative experience of like anger, pain, feeling distressed, things like this. And those are inexplicable as well. They don't seem to be like bad people get that experience. People who are really bad, they admit to being really bad in their lives, end up saying that they had this experience of kind of wholeness and peace. All to say, I don't know what to make of these things exactly, but the whole reason I'm talking about this today is because my uncle Wim, we call him William, he died. He had a heart attack, drove to the hospital. In fact, as he was driving, his heart was stopping. I mean, it's a stupid idea, but he didn't realize what was happening at the time. There happened to be a pastor on call who was, acting as clergy in the hospital, who was pulling out of the clergy spot. And my uncle parked in the clergy spot right next to the front door at that exact moment, gets out of the car, runs in, and just falls dead. His heart stops in the waiting room at the ER. Of course, they pull him, they resuscitate him, and so on. And my uncle, who is a man of science, he's a botanist. He ran the research botany lab at the University of Missouri for a long time. I have never heard him say a religious thing in my life. He explained to me, this was like 3 years after this happened, my uncle told me, my other uncle said, you need to ask Wim about his experience. I said, okay, so I asked Wim. It took a long time to cajole him to say this because he feels sheepish and ridiculous saying it, but he told me the story of how he floated above his body, he floated through the hospital, he ended up overhearing conversations of other doctors and nurses at other parts of the hospital. They were able to revive him, start his heart again. Later on, he saw some of those nurses and doctors and asked them about their conversations. I don't know what to do with this, but my uncle is a very different person ever since that happened. He has been transformed. Not to sound rude or whatever, but I mean, he was a bit of maybe neurotic before and so on, and he just seems more relaxed and happy than I've ever seen him in his life. I don't know what to do with this. I don't think this is like a proof of Jesus Christ's resurrection. Nonetheless, these experiences have convinced me that there's more to this world than I see. And so, all right, got a little bit left. So what do I do with these as a Christian then? So Dale Allison's book, he is a Christian. He says, I believe he's an Orthodox Christian. At the same time, he doesn't think that these experiences all necessarily point to Jesus 100%, right? Very clearly. Andrew Root has a very different story, one to ask us to think about how do we as Christians today think about miracles existing in the world. I got this book here too, Churches in the Crisis of Decline. He's got another great book that's more popular that just came out called When the Church Stops Working, which means something other than it seems. It's a trick title, When the Church Stops Working, but it's very good. So, and talks about some of these same things in that book. He is at Luther Seminary. He's a practical theologian there, but one of my favorite guys to read right now. And he tells a story about Karl Barth. So Karl Barth, famous Reformed theologian, he's from Switzerland in the German-speaking world, comes of age he's born in 1888, I think, comes of age and goes through seminary right before World War I. So Barth is the son of a pietist pastor, a very, very pious man, and becomes a pastor in part because it's kind of like the family profession in a way. But he's not, the way he talks about it at least, is that, he was a bit more political than he was religious, if that makes sense. He got into politics at the same time he kind of got into religion and became a pastor. He cared about his congregation, but when he says that he preached his sermons, he was preaching really about kind of what we should do as Christians in the world today. But in terms of like saying the word God, he said, I actually felt uncomfortable saying the word God because he lived in a world that was thoroughly modern. If you look at science, we think about like 1910 being very different, right? But no, there were great advancements in science, and people then lived in the imminent frame that we live in today. So, here we go, yeah. So Barth lived in this world. This is a young Karl Barth on the left there when he was a pastor in Sophenville, this small village. And he talks about how preaching through this kind of imminent frame, right, that he sees the world. And so he's convinced that like basically getting involved in politics is going to be the solution to the church advancing. In part, this is because of the plausibility structure that Barth lives in. So Peter Berger is a sociologist who talks about kind of societies and cultures having plausibility structures. That is to say, we accept what's plausible or not plausible, what's possible or impossible, based on like the world around us, right? Like what we're told is possible or not possible. And if we're told something's impossible from the time we're a little kid, we probably won't even notice it if it happens. That is to say that these structures filter the world for us. And one of the things we've learned about the brain, right, is that the brain is primarily a filtering tool. I mean, the vast majority, 99.9% of the input, the sensory input that you get is filtered out. What we get is a vastly reduced amount of the world in order for us, our little brains, to make sense of it. So that is to say, we're taught from an early age what to filter out and what to retain. So Barth's plausibility structure said that the idea of God was pretty incoherent. And so for him, saying the word God was pretty strange. So he says he didn't really preach much about God. World War I happened during Barth's time there as a pastor in Safaville. When World War I started, Barth said, obviously this is terrible, this is an awful thing. He's in Germany at the time as a pastor, and he says, of course this is an awful event. Germany should not go to war. I mean, you remember Germany kind of starts the war, right? They think they're being attacked by France and Russia, but they're not. So they go on the offensive and they attack France, and they start World War I. And Barth thinks this is a horrible thing. This is going to be a massive loss of life. He was right. But he's so surprised, not just by Germany going to war, because he knew it was a highly nationalistic time in Europe, but he was mostly surprised because 100%, actually all but one of his theology professors sign a document applauding the German government deciding to go to war, to start World War I. That is to say that his professors that he went to school with, that he learned from, were for the war. Now at the time, I'm gonna actually, let me see if I've got, no, okay. At the time, in Europe, in Germany especially, you really had two options. One was liberalism, which we've heard a lot about today. Liberal, this is liberal, that, whatever. Not like that. I mean, they were, I guess, politically progressive in some ways, but theological liberalism was more just applying the immanent frame to religion, to say the miracles of Jesus probably didn't happen, but Jesus is a good person and had good teachings about morality and ethics, and that's what we should kind of inhabit today. We should be good people. We should follow the kind of moral and ethical teachings of Jesus, and we can like weed out all that kind of ancient myth stuff. So demythologizing the stories of Jesus was a big idea back then, and Barth just believed this. These were his teachers. The other option was pietism, which we can say pietistic today or piety and mean a lot of different things, but it was very specific back then. In early 20th century Germany, pietism meant a form of faith where you were very like Orthodox Christian and you would pray fervently, but it was an internal kind of faith. It was a faith primarily about experiencing the peace and love of God through intense times of prayer and worship. And then you'd leave and it was kind of done. Like, you really primarily experienced God in your personal piety. And that was how you could be transformed. So there was this kind of like conservative internal faith, and there was this kind of liberal external faith, and they didn't really overlap at all. The liberal faith had kind of given up on the idea of God actually working in the world. It was up to us to fix the world. The conservative idea had kind of given up on the idea of being in the world at all with God. God worked inside us. Both of these are secular. That is to say, both of them participate fully in the secular world. Right? The secular world is fine with you talking about God as long as you keep it to yourself, keep it private, keep it personal, keep it within this space, these walls. You choose to come in here, and we'll keep it here. This is good, right? But that is to say, Barth realizes at the beginning of World War I that his two options are both thoroughly trapped in our immanent world. God either just appears to you personally and that's it, or God doesn't really exist and it's about us trying to make the world better ourselves. We're left alone to our devices. Then Barth hears about a third option. And these are two pietist pastors, but they were not pietist in any sense that Barth recognized. These were different folks. These are the Blumhardts. Barth hears about these folks after the beginning of World War I. They were kind of famous in their day, but their day had passed a bit. But Barth hears about these folks who were in this little town in the state of Württemberg in Germany, a little village, and The Johann Blumhardt on the left, he was the elder Blumhardt, and his son, who looks older in the picture, that's just the one I found, but his son, Christoph Blumhardt on the right, also continued the ministry of his father. But on the left there, that Johann Blumhardt was a kind of typical pietist pastor who believed in science and believed in medicine and all these things. And it was in the 1840s when there was a woman in his congregation, there's the elder Blumhardt on the right, there was a woman, Gottlieben Dittus, in his congregation, who began to have seizures, it seems, some sort of, at least that's what Blumhardt thought, some sort of epileptic seizure or fits, things like this. She started to have changes in her personality. Blumhardt, of course, thinks it's a medical condition, takes her to all kinds of doctors, gets her examined and so on, and really nothing ends up being terribly noticeable to the doctors. But Gottlieben ends up continuing to kind of get angrier and act stranger. And then she begins to speak in crazy voices. Then she begins to curse people out. She is the eldest daughter of three, she's the eldest of three children. She's an orphan, but she was in her 20s, so she was kind of taking care of two younger children. And then people start to hear noises. And like these are loud noises coming from all over the neighborhood. And people get really upset and they come over to the house. And eventually they realize there's something going on with this woman that is not normal. She's acting bizarre and speaking in bizarre ways and acting in bizarre ways. And somebody eventually says, maybe this is an evil spirit. And Blumhardt is this man of science who believes in like the God that, just like God makes me feel better when I pray. He believes in Jesus' resurrection, but that was a thing that happened long ago. Like we don't see crazy stuff like this happen today in Germany, the most advanced kind of scientific country in the world at that time. And he ends up going to this woman's house and trying to talk to her for a while, and he ends up trying to pray with her and things. And over time, he begins to be convinced that she's got some sort of demon possession. And for him, this takes a long time for him to even admit this stuff. He feels strange talking about it in public. But eventually, this strange noises and these, there are people from all over the country that begin to actually come to this place to witness this woman. It ends up becoming like a tourist trap in a way. And the police have to end up kicking people out of this house and like drawing like a line around it. And eventually, Johann Blumhardt, the elder, starts to go in and kind of pray for this woman and pray with her and so on. And then this woman starts to react violently to all of this. And I won't go into the whole story, but all to say that Blumhardt ends up kind of conducting this like years-long prayer seance for her. Just kind of praying. And this woman ends up screaming at one point in this, apparently, according to the Blumhardts, this very strange voice, Jesus is victor, and then she's done. She's fine, she's normal, she goes back to her normal life. She ends up kind of the rest of her life being a part of the Blumhardts' congregation. So Bart hears this story, and he ends up going to the Blumhardts' church right after World War I begins, and he goes there just to say, is it possible that God is acting in the world? Is it possible? And he goes there, and he doesn't find people who are trying to make a buck, right? They're not trying to make money. The Blumhardts aren't trying to like promote themselves, right? They're also not crazy, like they go to the doctors themselves, right? And they don't expect to see these things all the time. This is the one big thing that happens, right? This doesn't happen again. But the Blumhardts end up talking about this, kind of witnessing in a way to God's power. And the thing that Gottlieben says when she's released from whatever this is Jesus is victor. And this is kind of where I'll end. The Blumhardts end up taking this statement, Jesus is victor, and they talk about this as a watchword. So today we talk about mission statements. Like we have a mission statement. This church has a mission statement. The business everyone has a mission statement. Mission statement is about what we're going to do. I'm going to do this. We're going to do this. This is what we're going to do. The Blumhardts call this a watchword. It's really different. The Blumhardts end up saying that they aren't going to do anything. Christoph Blumhardt and Johann Blumhardt, they don't like show crucifixes. They don't do dramatic prayers. They don't cast out the demon. They don't do any of that stuff. They just sit there and watch and pray and ask God to do something. And eventually God does. And they take this to be the form for ministry. This is what we do. We watch for God. We watch for God to act. And we expect that God's going to do something. But at the same time, we can't control God. God's bigger than us. God's beyond us. They're fully living in their secular world, but yet they believe that there's a space for God to work in their own life. And they hold on to that faith. And they call this the watchword. one thing that I just want us to think about, I had some more to get to today, but in any event, there's Carl Bart visiting the church. One thing I'll get back to some of this next week. We'll start with that. But this idea that if we think about miracles, these strange experiences and so on, one of the things that comes up again and again in this literature is that people don't make this stuff happen. You can't conjure it up by faith. You can't kind of sit there and ask for it to happen and all of a sudden it does. Dale Allison has a whole chapter in his book about how prayer doesn't seem to work this way. Like you sit there and pray for it all you want, but it just kind of happens on its own, right? Or like God does it when you're not in control. And what Bart ends up taking away from his discussion with the Bloomharts is that God is the one who's in control. We can't make our church amazing by ourselves. We can't go out there and change Marietta by ourselves. We can't mission our way into being a successful and wonderful church. Maybe we can get lots of people to come to our church, but is it going to be what God wants us to be? Are we going to be doing what God wants us to do in the world? Instead, this idea of a watchword. How are we watching for God at work among us? What are we opening our eyes to? What are we expecting that God might be able to do among and through us? Not just for us, but for the world, for us in Marietta. What is God up to here? And it's not something where you know the answer in advance. And you don't know the timing in advance. It's just a game of waiting. And so Root talks about this, how like the church, like the Pentecost, right? You just have to sit there and wait, beginning of Acts. Jesus says, just wait here. You can't do anything. You just have to sit there and wait for God to move. But when God decides to move, then amazing and crazy things end up happening in the church. So I wonder for us, I got some other things to talk about next week. Don't worry, we'll get back to this. But questions to ponder here. Where have you sensed God as tangibly present and active in your life? And maybe it's some of these crazy stories. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's something much more mundane, but still true and real. And if you were to have a watchword, what would it be? How are you waiting and watching for God to be active? What are you kind of hoping and expecting that God does in your life and in the world? What would First Pres Marietta's watchword be if we had one? Just some things to think about for next week. So next week, I'm going to start off with continue this conversation a little bit about how God works in the world or how we might imagine God works in the world. But then I'm going to open it up. I've told you a couple stories from my life. I'm going to ask you, if you're bold enough and brave enough, to maybe share some of your own. We're going to start in small group conversations, but then I'm going to open it up. If anyone wants to share, no one has to share. Don't worry. You won't be judged for sharing. And also, not for not sharing, you also won't be judged for sharing. That is to say, this will be a space of trust and a space to help each other think about how God works in the world. And maybe to think about our watchword. All right, I'll stay after for questions, conversation. I know this is a strange kind of talk to give in our modern secular era, so I'm happy to take questions. Even I'm happy for you to come back at me and tell me that you don't think it's right. I'm happy to have that conversation as well. And I'll see you all next week. Peace.